Long before Europe shaped its financial identity, long before Venetian bankers inked their ledgers or the Medici perfected double-entry bookkeeping, China had already taken a leap the rest of the world wouldn't dare for centuries. They created value without metal, wealth without weight, a currency forged not in mines, but in imagination. Paper money wasn't just an invention, it was a revolution that rewrote how economies could function. Welcome to Capital Decode, the story of ancient China, where innovation, ambition, and risk collided, and the future of money quietly began. For most of history, money seemed simple. Metal in your hand, value in your pocket. Gold if you were lucky, copper if you were ordinary, and barter if you were desperate. But the reality is that money has never been about the material it's made from. It has always been about the story people choose to believe, and no civilization understood that better or earlier than ancient China. Long before paper money became a global standard, China had already begun wrestling with a question the rest of the world didn't even know existed. What happens when people trust symbols more than silver? The answer didn't arrive as a grand political decree or a philosopher's brilliant theory. It came from something far less glamorous: logistics. China was huge, far larger and more economically complex than any empire of the same era. Goods moved across mountains, deserts, and river networks that spanned thousands of kilometers. Markets weren't local. They were interconnected. And in a society built on movement, metal suddenly became a problem. Copper was heavy, iron was heavier. Transporting the wealth you earned could cost more than the value itself. Merchants began to learn that prosperity had a weight limit. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Caravans carrying metal became targets. River barges overloaded with coins sank in storms. And every local government mint produced its own version of copper cash, creating a confusing mosaic of regional currencies that didn't always match in purity or weight. A farmer might sell grain in one province only to discover that his payment wasn't accepted in the next. Wealth was slow, inconsistent, and physically exhausting. China's economy was advancing too quickly for its money to keep up. When currencies failed to meet the needs of daily life, new solutions emerged from the people directly affected. So merchants, not emperors, made the first move. In bustling markets and trading hubs, shopkeepers and guilds began issuing certificates that represented stored metal. Instead of carrying sacks of coins, customers could carry a slip of paper acknowledging its value. These early notes weren't intended to be revolutionary. They were meant to make commerce lighter, safer, and faster. But they planted a seed, the idea that value could exist even when the metal stayed behind. At first, these certificates were trusted only within tightly knit groups. But trade expanded. Towns grew, and the convenience of paper began attracting more participants. People realized the truth. The note itself didn't matter. What mattered was the reputation of the issuer. If a merchant house was wealthy and respected, its paper became as good as copper. If it wasn't, its notes became worthless. In other words, paper money spread not because of government authority, but because of social confidence. China's economy was teaching one of the hardest lessons in finance. Trust is infrastructure, but trust is also fragile. As merchants gained influence, so did the risks. Some issued more notes than their reserves could support. Some forged others' certificates. Disputes erupted over whose paper was real and whose was a scam. The market had created innovation, but it had also created chaos. And that chaos reached a level the government could no longer ignore. What happened next would redefine the future of money. China's rulers didn't simply regulate paper currency, they recognized its potential. They understood that if private paper could move an economy, state-issued paper could reshape an empire. The world was standing on the edge of a financial transformation, one that would test the limits of belief, authority, and economic imagination. But before the government could take control, it had to solve a more fundamental problem. How do you turn a merchant's convenience into a nation's backbone? The answer would push China into a new economic era, and the world into a new way of thinking. The moment the state stepped in, paper money crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. What merchants created out of necessity, the government now sought to harness as a tool of power. But empires don't adopt innovations because they're clever. They adopt them because pressure leaves no alternative. China was changing at a speed no previous dynasty had ever managed. Its population was soaring, its trade networks were sprawling across continents, and its bureaucracy needed a financial system capable of supporting millions of transactions without collapsing under its own weight. Metal currency, once the backbone of the economy, was struggling to keep pace with ambition. The state's first move was not dramatic, but decisive. It unified the system. Instead of countless private notes issued by guilds, shops, and wealthy merchant houses, the government introduced a standard official paper currency. These new notes were marked with imperial seals and printed warnings against forgery, broadcasting the authority behind them. But standardizing the currency was only the beginning. The real shift, the one that changed everything, was the state monopoly. Overnight, private issuance became illegal. The empire didn't want competition, it wanted control. Every piece of paper representing value now flowed through a single source, the government. But authority alone could not make people believe. So the state promised something concrete: convertibility. Citizens could redeem their notes for metal, silk, or other commodities held in reserve. The message was simple. The paper was not replacing wealth. It was representing it. And for a time, this system worked beautifully. Markets became more efficient. Trade routes expanded. Heavy, clumsy strings of copper coins gave way to lightweight documents that could travel from one end of the empire to the other. China's economy, once restrained by physics, was suddenly liberated by imagination. Yet this newfound power carried a hidden danger. Unlike metal, paper could be created with astonishing ease. No mining, no smelting, no transport, just ink, fiber, and a printing block. And when an empire discovers how easy it is to print value, temptation becomes policy. Slowly at first, then more boldly, the government began issuing notes faster than the economy could absorb them. Paper money, once an elegant solution to logistical problems, began feeding an inflationary spiral no one fully understood. Prices rose. Confidence wavered, and with each new issuance, the promise of convertibility looked less secure. People responded as people always do when trust begins to erode. They hedged. Some rushed to redeem their notes for metal before reserves ran short. Others traded paper for goods, fearing that every delay would make the currency worth less tomorrow than it was today. Local markets began rejecting older notes, demanding newer issues with supposedly higher credibility. And even as the government tried to intervene, by adjusting denominations, restricting issuance, or recalling worn notes, the system grew increasingly fragile. Paper had freed the economy, but it had also unshackled the state's worst impulses. Still, even in these difficulties, China pioneered ideas the world wouldn't revisit for centuries. It experimented with expiration dates, forcing notes to be turned in before losing validity. An early form of circulation control. It introduced region-specific currencies to match local economic conditions. It built administrative networks solely devoted to monitoring currency flow, supply levels, and redemption cycles. These policies were imperfect, but they were bold. Each one represented a step toward understanding what it truly meant to manage a symbolic economy. And through all of this, the central truth of paper currency emerged more clearly. Money was no longer about metal. It wasn't about scarcity, weight, or physical worth. It was about belief, collective, fragile, powerful belief. China had stumbled onto a financial revolution, the idea that value could be created and sustained by a system of promises. And while those promises sometimes faltered, they pushed the empire into a new era of economic possibility, one defined not by the resources beneath the ground, but by the confidence of the people above it. By the time the Song dynasty reached its final century, paper money had already transformed China's economy in ways no prior civilization could have imagined. But history rarely lets innovations mature peacefully. As neighboring powers pressed against China's borders and internal strains deepened, paper currency shifted from a tool of prosperity to an instrument of survival. And survival, especially for an empire under pressure, is expensive. The government printed more notes, each issue drifting further from the reserves meant to back it. Inflation rose, confidence cracked, and the system that had once propelled China forward now threatened to pull it apart. Yet this was only the beginning, because a new force was about to reshape the future of currency altogether. That force was the Mongol Empire. When the Mongols swept across Asia in the 13th century, they destroyed cities, toppled kingdoms, and rewrote entire political landscapes. But they were not indifferent conquerors. They studied the systems of the lands they absorbed. And in China, where Kublai Khan founded the Yuan dynasty, they encountered a technology more valuable than any fortress or battlefield victory: paper money. Unlike previous rulers, Kublai didn't treat currency as a mere administrative tool. He saw it as the backbone of imperial power. For a vast empire connecting East Asia, Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East, a unified monetary system wasn't just useful, it was revolutionary. So when the UN government embraced paper currency, it did so without hesitation. Private minting was banned, metal currency diminished. And soon, paper notes became the primary medium of exchange across one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. What the Song dynasty had built regionally, the Mongols expanded into a transcontinental financial system. And unlike earlier notes, which had been partially backed, UN paper money relied almost entirely on fiat authority. The promise wasn't redemption. The promise was obedience. You accepted the emperor's money because the emperor commanded it. The Mongols enforced this through law, logistical integration, and the sheer scale of their state apparatus. In effect, they created the first large-scale fiat currency system in history. Foreign visitors like Marco Polo were stunned. They watched as bark from mulberry trees was transformed into money by decree alone. Polo described the process with amazement, noting that notes were accepted everywhere in the Great Khan's dominions. Europeans, accustomed to metal, found this sorcery. But in China, the system had been evolving for centuries. To them, paper money was simply the logical next step in economic sophistication. Yet even the Mongols couldn't escape the trap that awaits every state managing fiat currency. As military expenses ballooned and administration costs grew, the temptation to print became irresistible. Kublai's successors issued new rounds of notes, each one thinning the authority behind the currency. Markets grew wary, inflation intensified, and by the mid-14th century, the UN monetary system was buckling under the weight of its own excess. When the dynasty collapsed and the Ming took power, the new rulers didn't reform the currency, they abolished it outright. China, birthplace of paper money, abandoned it for centuries, traumatized by the volatility it had unleashed. But the idea didn't die there. It waited. In memory, in records, in the logic of commerce. Because once a society has tasted the power of symbolic value, metal alone feels insufficient. Modern economies would eventually adopt the very principles China pioneered: centralized issuance, legal tender status, fractional backing, and eventually pure fiat systems. The world discovered what China learned a millennium earlier, that the true foundation of money isn't metal or paper, but collective belief. Trust is the real currency, and when trust breaks, systems fall. Yet when it holds, it enables trade, growth, and entire civilizations. China's experiment was messy, brilliant, daring, and dangerous. And in many ways, the global financial system we live with today is a continuation of that story. The technologies changed, the borders changed, the institutions changed. But the underlying truth remains the same. Money works because people agree it works. That agreement is fragile, powerful, and endlessly renegotiated, a psychological contract binding economies together. China discovered that first. The rest of the world is still learning it. In the end, ancient China didn't just reshape money. They exposed the truth behind every financial system we rely on today. Innovation sparks momentum. Momentum invites excess. Excess corrodes trust. And when trust fractures, the entire structure falls with it. History doesn't move in circles, but if you ignore its lessons, it'll blindside you just the same. If this shifted how you see money, hit subscribe. The past leaves clues, and I'll help you follow them.